So I consider this an unprecedented event to get 5 people who have spent, a huge amount of years studying this, analyzing this, thinking about this, talking about it, debating it, writing books, to get them together in one room to speak to you, to speak to our live stream audience, and to speak to people now and in the future who will end up watching this video. This, to me, is the most accurate source of information on GMOs on the planet. All the people here have no agenda. They're not in the seed business. They don't own anything related. They are just truth seekers that are on your side who, for whatever reason, have decided to take their time to fight so the public gets the truth, and we're very grateful to them. So I'd like to open up by asking each of you to just tell me what you're doing. In other words, of all the things in life you could do, you took all your time, you're researching a subject like GMOs, you must feel that there's something important here, because when I tell people about this, a lot of people shrug like, yeah, GMOs, no big deal. I just went to a movie, a pro-GMO movie 2 weeks ago that someone put out, talking about how the benefits of GMOs. And at the end, they asked people, are you more open to GMOs? And 3/4 of the room raised their hand. So a lot of people are feeling like GMOs are no big deal. I mean, no problem. So you obviously, if you are writing books and lecturing and spending all your time, you must have some much different thought than what a lot of people I know think. So could you each state what's going on? Why are you writing books about GMO? Why is this such an important topic? Why is it necessary for you to put your life into a subject like GMOs when you could be using your time and efforts on something else? You must think there's some important reason that the general public or a lot of people are not aware of. So if you could answer that, each of you, to start, that would be good.
All right, well, I'll just start with the hell. I mean, I suppose the question, what else would I be doing in life? What am I going to do? Go start playing tennis, 3 times a week at the local Trump club? Probably unlikely. But I suppose the question is why. I'm a journalist. My background is in investigative reporting, and I've also been covering environmental stories for a long time, several decades now. And I don't write exclusively about GMOs, but I do write about the environmental challenges of our time. I've just written a book called Seeds of Resistance, The Struggle for Our Food Supply. And as part of that book, it's not the whole book, but anyway, as part of that book, I talk about GMOs and explore what basically the status of GMOs in our food system and what that means. Why is that important to me? Because I remember back 25 years ago when GMOs were first introduced into the United States. And there was a lot of discussion about this brand new technology that was going to feed a lot of hungry people, that was going to increase crop yields, and it was just going to do it with the slight manipulation of the genetic codes. And suddenly, within several years of the discussion beginning, these seeds were suddenly widespread across the food system of the United States and soon to come the world. So the question that I began with was, what are these seeds? What are we planting in a huge amount of farm fields in this country? The companies tell us that all they're doing is shifting a gene or two. I don't know. I'm not a geneticist. That doesn't sound so simple, but it can be done. I've now seen a GMO being created. There's a gene gun that actually shoots a gene from one organism into another gene. That's literally how it happens. So as a journalist, my question radar went up, and I wanted to know, what are these new inventions that are suddenly deeply embedded in our food system? So I went out with an open mind to actually figure out what these are, and do the claims of the companies that are behind them, they're really a very small number of companies that are behind GMOs, match up to the reality on the ground. And I came up with a number of different realizations in this process, which we can talk about probably a little more without getting into too much detail right now. But that was the motive, to figure out what was going on in our food system and on our farms with the introduction of GMOs. We can get in later to some of the things that I found. Thank you.
Is this on? No? How do you turn this on? It's on now. Is it on? You can hear? Okay. Yeah, I went to NYU Law School in New York City, and I'm an environmental attorney. And so a lot of what I was concerned with and what we had been concerned with as far as protecting the environment had to do with protecting it from chemical pollution. This is industrial chemicals, agricultural chemicals, the contamination of our streams, our rivers, the human health consequences of that. And that seemed like a really, really big challenge when I was a young man to deal with that and to become part of a number of NGOs and public institutes that did that. Then genetic engineering came around. And I realized a couple things. One is that this was bringing a whole new kind of pollution to us, and one that was extremely concerning. Because with chemical pollution, it was terrible. You spray, it could contaminate groundwater, contaminate for many, many decades. But with biological pollution, when you fundamentally change the germline of bacteria, of plants and animals, and then release them into the environment, that does not end over a couple of generations. That does not dilute over time like chemical pollution. That increases, it reproduces, it disseminates, and it cannot be recalled. So that scared the you-know-what out of me. And then when I began to see that they were really engineering in ignorance, that they were engineering bacteria and releasing them, that they were engineering plants and animals and releasing them, that's when I realized that this is something I had to devote a good bit of my life to if I was going to really be a responsible environmental attorney. And that is what I do to this day. For example, right now that we are in litigation to stop the introduction of genetically engineered salmon. A small company in AquaBounty has genetically engineered the salmon with a bunch of foreign genetic material from pouts and other fish to make it grow more rapidly. Unfortunately, there's a physiological problems with those salmon, cranial issues, and what scientists have seen is that because of this physiological problems, should these genetically engineered salmon mate with native salmon, there'll be 1/3 greater death in their offspring. Well, that's pretty scary. But even worse than that, because they're larger, they'll be more attractive in mating. So you have Darwin on his head. You've got salmon who are larger, more attractive, right, for native salmon to mate with, but you'll have 1/3 greater death in the offspring. According to scientists at Purdue and others who looked at this, if 60 of those salmon were to escape, and you know that'll happen, into a population of 30,000, you'd have extinction of that native species because of this terrible arithmetic in about 30 generations. And these are the salmon, iconic salmon that we've been trying to save for so long. So that's just one example, because once those salmon escape, once they're released, you can't recall them. You can't say, oops, oops. And that terrible arithmetic of extinction will happen. So biological pollution is the poster child for the precautionary principle. It is a fundamental and existential threat to the integrity of the entire biotic community. And as such, it needs to be taken very, very seriously. Now, on top of that, it has the added advantage of adding to our chemical pollution. Because Monsanto and the boys decided one of the few things that's actually been working, and we can talk about how the science in this is terribly flawed and why this revolution is never going to happen and hasn't happened in a big way. But they have invented plants that can withstand, as you guys know, they're herbicides. They're chemical companies. They said, we got to sell more chemicals. So I know what we'll do is we'll have corn and cotton and soy that is tolerant to our chemicals, Roundup, for example. That way we can aerial spray Roundup on the corn. It won't kill the corn, which it normally would have, because they're genetically engineered now to tolerate it. It'll just kill the weeds. So hundreds of millions of more pounds of Roundup have been put on our crops the last 13 years. Now, of course, the weeds have gotten resistant, so now they're moving to an element of Agent Orange, Dow Chemical, right, called 2,4-D, and now Monsanto is introducing an order because Roundup is no longer really working in many areas, dicamba. So along with this terrible biological pollution, they're using this technology to massively sell more of their chemicals and create even more chemical pollution. So a really unholy marriage. And we are currently in litigation to stop, we already stopped it once, we're going to stop again, the proliferation of this 2,4-D tolerant corn and soy and cotton. We're right in the middle of that litigation right now, and we're right in the middle of the litigation to stop dicamba. And this is this terribly volatile herbicide that is so volatile that the state of Arkansas just banned it. So it's great for our litigation. When a State of the Union says, hey, this is so bad we're not going to use it, why is the EPA approving it? So a number of our litigations, and we just finished some legal work and legislative work to stop the introduction of genetically engineered mosquitoes. Again, think about that out there and how you're going to control those. So just remember, when you hear chemical pollution, remember biological pollution, because it's an existential threat to us and to the entire biotic community. And those are a couple of reasons I've got involved.
Thanks. So can you turn this green one on? Is that, you guys hear me all right?
Go on.
I just want to say, first of all, that my own work has been inspired by pretty much everybody on this panel, so I'm grateful to be here. I've been watching your work for a long time. So I've spent about the last 10 years writing about some of these very issues. The evolution of big chemical companies into big food companies, which is, we've already heard, has already gone on hand in glove for 50 years or so. One thing I wanted to mention, though, so I'm an environmental journalist, but I also am a professor of what's now known as environmental humanities, which is using all the tools of cultural analysis and environmental science to think about these questions from very large and complicated perspectives. And one thing I'd like to add to this conversation, we're going to hear quite a bit about the science and about the politics, but it's also interesting to think about the structural, in this case actually infrastructural roots of a lot of these problems. And when I talk to my students about this, I ask them to think about what happened right around the end of the Second World War. As all these chemicals were being introduced and being turned from chemical weapons into chemical fertilizers, there were other things going on in the country. Most importantly, for my mind, was the construction of the interstate highway system. Now, if you think about this just for 1 second, it used to be in the United States, and it still is true in places like Europe, you used to have cities surrounded by farms. And you can still go to old cities in Europe, and you can stand on a tall building in the middle of Rome or the middle of Lyon, France, and look out and you can still see farms. And that's no longer true in American cities. So after World War II, we built the interstate highway system. If you think about it, driving down I-95, you'll often see a sign that says the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, and it's got 5 stars on it. The interstate highway system was originally built as a measure of homeland security. After the war, we'd seen the Autobahn. We decided we were going to build an infrastructure that would protect us should we ever be invaded. So we built the highway system, 95 down the East Coast. All the odd numbers go from east to west all the way across the country. The even numbers go east to west. And we have an entire grid now of something like 43,000 miles of interstate highways. These are big 4, 5, 6 lane highways. So that was all fine, well and good, intended as homeland security. What it allowed to happen, though, of course, was once all these hundreds of thousands of soldiers came back from the war, these big highways allowed them to envision living outside of the city. So now, as we all know, the suburbanization of the United States happened in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And we lost, I think the number is about 4 million small farms. They were all buried under concrete. They were turned into highways and subdivisions and shopping malls. So now what you had was cities with the big population centers surrounded by rings and rings and rings of suburbs, all built on top of farms. So among the things that happened was the complete destruction of the local food economy, which is something we'll talk about later, and the migration of food production to the Midwest, where now we have, instead of lots and lots of small farms, we have very few very large farms, all consolidated under the control of a very small number of companies. So all the things that we've already heard about being scaled up, the scaling up of chemical use, the scaling down of genetic diversity of different kinds of seeds, the scaling up of monoculture crops, all this was coincidental with the destruction of the local food economy, which happened over these last few years. I live in Baltimore. In the state of Maryland alone, we've lost 1 million acres of farms and forests to suburbanization in a very small state just in the last couple of decades. So all these farms move out to the Midwest, and they all get consolidated under these few companies, and the highways now allow, in addition to the consolidation of all these companies, the rapid and long distance movement of food. So suddenly you can have chicken nuggets created in one place and put on a truck and driven 1,500 miles to some restaurant somewhere. And that's the way Americans have now come to eat. What do we eat? We eat pizza and chicken nuggets and cheap meat. And that's because we can. It's very efficient to make that work as a business model. So the GMO thing, which we're up here to talk about, is really symptomatic of a much more complicated and deep structural problem with the food system. It's all part of it. It's not the only part of it. So I'll just be up here to kind of keep us thinking about issues from GMOs all the way down the rabbit hole into the way the food system in this country has evolved over the last few decades. I think it's more depressing than just the GMO question. It's deeper and more problematic and worth talking about.
Thank you. It's possible, I have this. It's possible that those of us who are working to successfully stop GMOs may end up protecting more people from ill health or death than any group in human history. Because GMOs may be that dangerous. If you looked at the charts that I showed earlier with more than 30 diseases rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup, that represents tens of millions or over 100 million people with diseases and disorders. And if you consider that the biotech industry's stated goal, according to a consultant of Monsanto in January of 1999 in a San Francisco conference, said that he asked the Monsanto executive to describe their ideal future. And they described a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds were genetically engineered and patented, and the consultant worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. That goal to replace the seed supply has only expanded to now include, as Andy said, insects, fish, livestock, algae, bacteria, fungus, trees, shrubs, grasses, essentially to replace nature. When you look at the fact that the number one result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects, and you multiply that by all of these species and by all of the iterations and generations of those species, the chances of coming up with something that's a disaster is pretty high. But I would submit that we've already come up with a disaster. We've already come up with pesticide delivery mechanisms in the form of GMO and BT crops with huge negative impacts on the population. And I get supported by the fact that I've surveyed 3,256 people who got better from 28 different conditions when they switched to non-GMO and largely organic food. But I've also interviewed many, many doctors who've taken people onto a non-GMO diet, because I've inspired thousands and thousands of doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets, and I've heard their reports, and the changes are predictable, consistent, and dramatic. So I am convinced that the upturn of many diseases starting in late 1990s and early 2000 is largely a result of the GMOs and the Roundup sprayed on them. And that if we, in fact, allow this generation to be, as the biotech industry wants, to eliminate the products of the billions of years of evolution and replace it with designer organisms designed for greater profit and control, then we are, as Andy said, in an irreversible situation. The only thing that lasts longer than the self-propagating genetic pollution is extinction. So I would consider this an A+ priority for human civilization and for nature. And I'm always looking for strategic ways to eliminate it in the fastest possible way to protect nature for all future generations. So it's not something we as a generation asked to do, but it's our duty and our responsibility to address it because this is the generation where the decisions are being made for all future generations.
Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. So, my background, my education began in the study of physics, and both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And physics is one of the disciplines that's probably the most rigorous in terms of producing knowledge and getting consensus amongst the community. There's very high standards of validating any claims before you'll find it in the textbooks. And after my studies, I then went to study philosophy and philosophy of science because I wanted to understand the nature of how knowledge gets produced more broadly. So I study controversies in sciences and in how these controversies lead to consensus or lack of consensus, and how knowledge gets produced in various fields, in biology and sociology, many other fields. And I started writing about gene splicing early on when the first controversies erupted in the 1970s, and published a book in 1982 called Genetic Alchemy to make people understand that this was a kind of alchemy, mixing of things that people didn't quite know what the results were going to be, but they had great hopes that it would produce a golden calf. But I also have written about other controversies, chemicals, endocrine disruptors particularly, stem cells, risk analysis, and eventually I got to GMOs. So it was a path. Wherever I see a new technology develop and where there are controversies, I tend to study it. And GMOs have many interesting and different kinds of controversies. What do foreign genes do in these new systems, in these plants? Will GMO food contribute to human health or human sickness? Will it contribute to the environment? And you can find all these controversies in the scientific literature. And I think what I typically do best at is delving into the scientific literature and trying to understand why published papers disagree about issues and what is the basis of this disagreement. And I also reached a conclusion that there really are three pillars to a democratic, free democratic society. The first is that each person has the right, the privilege, and the opportunity to vote. The second is that we have a free and independent press. And the third is that we have a free and independent scientific establishment. And all three of those are extremely important, because it's the scientific establishment that feeds public information about what's true and what's false. And there are many ways of fixing your belief, but I haven't found a better way than through the understanding of how scientists find the truth about a particular topic. So when scientists disagree, I'm usually trying to find out why there's disagreement. And that's why I started studying the issue of GMOs.